Faraday's Mirror, Chapter 20, A Fortress on a Hill. The next 72 hours passed in much the same fashion for Cole and Byron. Sore feet, tired legs, and conversation between the brothers and Crowmain, punctuated by occasional sightings of strange creatures. Rochester's column marched endlessly on, mostly at a slight downhill grade, through forest and foothills, onto an undulating grassy plain, then into a wide valley between low, rounded grassy mountains. They passed through a pine forest, the upper branches of which were populated by brownies. The tiny humanoids moved like squirrels, leaping from branch to branch and climbing trunks. It was a joy to watch them, and they put smiles on Byron's and Cole's faces. "Not so pleasant when shoot you with poisoned arrows," Crowmain observed tartly. At the end of their second march, they crossed the churning river on a stout log bridge and camped on the far side, where a few redcoats manned a squat garrison house. From scraps of conversation he overheard in line for dinner, boiled meat and crackers, Byron gathered this was the only safe crossing for 50 miles in either direction. It had been built by the British for their campaign against the Yelk clan Lothka. The final day's march passed through cultivated farmland. Large fields stood on both sides of the road growing various crops, corn, wheat, oats, tobacco, all irrigated through a system of clay pipes. Log cabins dotted the landscape, and farmers in overalls and straw hats waved and smiled at the column as they passed. In one large field, a group of skeletons dug smallish potatoes and deposited them in an ox cart manned by a top-hatted necrologist. In the distance ahead of them, a single plume of smoke could occasionally be seen curling into the rose-colored sky. Left to themselves and trying to ignore their aching feet, Byron and Cole amused each other by singing songs, and singing them badly. Neither had a great voice, and Byron had a talent for mistaking lyrics. A lot of times the songs ended abruptly or faded into spirited humming or air guitar riffs, as the brothers realized neither of them could remember the whole verse. Nevertheless, the time passed more quickly, and their selection, mostly alternative rock, the classic stuff their dad listened to, and a few Michael Jackson and James Brown hits sprinkled in, reminded them of family road trips in the minivan. As they rounded out a trio of songs, R.E.M.'s Losing My Religion, Joan Jett's I Love Rock and Roll, and Charlie Daniels' The Devil Went Down to Georgia, Crowmain interrupted them. "Do you know any song stories of length?" "You mean like epic poems?" Cole asked. He'd also read the Odyssey, Beowulf, and Gilgamesh as part of his English studies. "Long stories of battle and bloodshed, deeds of valor done by gods and heroes. These are, you say, epic poems?" "Yeah," Cole said, "they are, but we don't know any of them." He laughed out loud. They're thousands of lines long. How can anyone be expected to remember so many words? I mean, now that there are books and movies, what would be the point? Byron snorted in agreement. "We've read them," he said. He listened to the Odyssey and actually read Beowulf. "We could tell you what happens, but we can't sing them." "Singing just now, you told many thousands of lines," Crowmain shrugged, his tone of voice expressing an understated dislike of their songs. "And yet you show no signs of stopping." Cole responded thoughtfully. "I suppose we have." "How's the arm?" Byron asked, changing the subject. "Pains me," Crowmain replied. "But pain means life." He brought it to his nose and sniffed. "It has not sickened, nor have I. This is good." "Do you know any songs of battle and bloodshed, deeds of valor?" Cole asked, changing the subject back. Lothka songs?" "No many," Crowmain replied, "but in my own language. Loudly I sing them at gatherings, feasts. Stories share the wisdom of the Ilinthane." "Sing us one," Byron urged. "We'd love to hear it, right, Cole?" "Yeah," Cole agreed, swatting at a horsefly that had been buzzing around his head for the past 20 minutes. He wrinkled his nose, too. He hadn't bathed in longer than he cared to remember, and he began to tire of the smell of his own sweat. At 14, Byron didn't yet stink like he did. Crowmain nodded to Byron, then he sang. But his rich, deep song might more properly be called a chant. The words were sonorous and flowed into each other, full of rhythms and alliteration, but no obvious rhyme. Though they couldn't understand it, the two boys were spellbound. Even Rochester slowed his horse to ride alongside and listen, his saber jangling in its scabbard. The lieutenant smiled occasionally, as if he understood the meaning. After many uninterrupted minutes, he held up his hand, stopping Crowmain's song. "Now I approve of your selection, Lothka." He nodded condescendingly. "The song of the third worm war is the best of your native lays." Crowmain glowered up at him, grim-faced, saying nothing. "Now I have," Rochester offered a winning smile, "even made an English translation of the early verses. It remains a work in progress, though, I admit." "You're a soldier and a scholar?" Cole asked. All effective officers must be both, Rochester explained. We practice the arts of study and observation, for both apply to warfare, and to paraphrase the wise Chinaman Sun Tzu, to overcome a potential enemy, one must understand his culture. Besides, he shrugged, one must have something to occupy one's thoughts on the long marches. Sing us your translation, Byron urged. I really do want to know what he said. I don't sing, Rochester pursed his lips, except on Sundays in cathedral. But if you like, I can tell it as a poem. Byron nodded vigorously. Cole, too, nodded, but with only half-hearted attention. He'd begun to focus on the nearing smoke plume, which curled up from over the rise ahead. He'd noticed a sparkle of what he assumed were steel rails cutting across the field in the distance, and he suspected that they were nearing a railroad crossing or depot. Mind you, Rochester warned, it remains a work in progress. Lothka poetry is wild and erratic in rhyme and line, and it is alliterative, tied together by repeating sounds. The language structure is different as well. It doesn't convert very well into English. I always find myself having to choose between keeping the meaning and losing the sound, or keeping the sound and losing the meaning. I fear that by trying to keep both, I really accomplish neither. Rochester smiled sadly. In any case, this is what I've translated and committed to memory thus far. He said, It's funny that even here in this culture, epics begin with an invocation of the muses, storytelling gods. Greek Homer did it, and Roman Virgil, Dante, and even our own Milton. It amuses me how much cultures, even across different times and worlds, are the same, despite their differences. Perhaps it says something about the essential oneness of humanity. He paused to consider his observation, then cleared his throat and began. Sing loud, sing long, Ilin, sing through my lips. A swordsman's song drunk on blood and valor. A sage's song, world-wise, old and worn with years. A song of mourning, wending, bending, torn with tears. A song of armies, of dragons and of men, clad in gilt armor, glistening upon the ground, of helms flashing, faces stern, and eyes that burn. Of banners flapping and horns blaring, of stallions stamping and worms glaring. Of gods immaculate, fearless, in full array, of dragons' arrogant, invincible might, ordered for war, core upon core, horrific sight. Beneath lofty worm spines, rock-strewn ridgeline of sky-scratching granite, its ice-crowned gold with light, bold warriors wait, shields toward the sun, backs to the sight, banners snap taut in a wailing west wind, hearts hammer a cadence beneath armored skin, calling forth courage, Faldan, godlike, sublime, urges them forward to combat, to strife, to cheerfully greet worms with spear, sword, and knife. Better off dead than alive in defeat, a brave war cry echoes, horns thunder off peaks, the army advances without further speech. Across the brown plain, undaunted in sight, of warriors in arms, boldly striding toward strife, rears Drakdath the mighty, a terror, glistening black, a writhing worm horde, awaits war at his back, dripping venom that sizzles and sears crisp dead grass, and steams into dirt. His words strike like spear thrusts that splinter wood shields, and all his horde hears him and marks every word. So soldiers draw near, sun upon shields, feeling no fear, leave not one alive on this yellow-brown plain. Instead pile corpses, a mound of the slain, to rival that which Yulk built at Galheim. The wyverns take flight. The lesser worms wriggle, blazing serpents stride forth, but the dragons delay, awaiting that moment when armies engage. The bright lines of men form walls with their shields, with a clash of precision that well-trained men wield. The scales of the wyverns show red, bronze, and gold. They wing through the air while worms slither beneath, each fire within them longing to breach that horrible gift only dragons bequeath. Arrows arc high, spears fly afield, iron shields boomed, battered by flames, and burning men gurgle their short-fated doom. A high-pitched steam whistle peeped cheerfully from beyond the hill. Rochester cleared his throat. It appears that's all the time I have today. If you gentlemen will excuse me. Without waiting for a response, he cantered forward toward the front of the column, his horse's hooves clattering on the dry ground. Byron watched the receding red of his jacket. Burning men gurgle their short-fated doom, he repeated, awe and revulsion in his voice. He turned toward Cromane. Was that translation accurate? He asked. Yes, accurate, Cromane grudgingly admitted. His eyes, too, followed Rochester for the first time with a hint of respect. Wormspine's rock-strewn ridgeline, Cole quoted. The Wormspine's clearly a mountain range, and you called the river where you met us Worm Hod. He pointed at the distant snow-capped mountains, lit now by a sunrise glow coming from away across the plain. Are those? Called the Worm Hertha in our tongue. Wormspine in yours, Cromane replied. So, the battle took place here? Byron asked. Not here, Cromane said. Stretch the mountains long, many marches there. He pointed north. Byron nodded. He looked that way, imagining the sky filled with dragons, and a thrill went up his backbone. He broke into goosebumps. They crested the rise, and below them, as Cole had predicted, the smoke rose from a steam train. It was a smallish train, not the kind of one would expect to see in a Western movie, but more of a homemade-looking job. A cylindrical boiler attached to a narrow smokestack, 4 small wheels rested on the track in front, and a pair of large, powered wheels in the back. These were painted red and spoked. The rail was of a narrow gauge, thinner than any track Byron had ever seen. 5 open wagons were hooked up behind the engine, and each resting on 2 pair of small spoked wheels. The engine smoked next to a whitewashed log station with a water tower and a coal shed. The whistle tweeted again. Byron noted what looked like a telephone line running along the track on poles, following it off into the distance. A puff of steam escaped the engine, and it lurched backward away from them. Byron watched Rochester canter down the road, catch up to the engine, and signal the engineer. A whoosh of bright white steam sounded, and the engine stopped. Rochester signaled the column, and they increased their pace double time. It seemed they'd be traveling the rest of the way by train. 3 bumpy, soot-stained hours later, they clattered into Sterling City. Fort Douglas loomed over the valley town. Set on a rounded grass hump in the middle of a flat, to Byron it looked like too perfect a circle to be naturally occurring hill. The fort consisted of 2 layers of defenses, an encircling log palisade about halfway up and buttressed with wooden towers, and a large rectangular brick and log construction seated atop the hill itself. The building had an odd architectural sense, a combination of some kind of Viking great hall with a Chinese Buddhist temple, Byron thought. Built of red brick, the bottom story met the next at an overhanging, steeply slanted roof. This stopped partway up at a second story constructed from thick logs and also roofed with an overhang and a steep angle. A tall square brick tower stood over one end, topped with battlements. A pair of huge flags fluttered from a pole over the tower. On top flew the black-backed Union Jack, and under it a crimson falcon on a white field. The, quote, city itself looked like a frontier town. A long main street dotted with affluent shop faces, as well as some more notable buildings. A stone mill with a churning water wheel jutted out over the river that ran by the station. At the other end of town, a pair of brick buildings, one 2 stories and one 3, loomed over the street. Each was backed with an enormous brick smokestack that belched out black clouds. Wires ran from the furthest of them along a series of poles to the fort on the hill and to the train station. Across the street from these factories squatted a 1-story stone church with a tall steeple, topped with a copper crucifix. Behind these buildings, the houses of the villagers, small log and clay brick hovels, fanned out in a haphazard fashion. "Roy, everyone off," ordered the sergeant with the sideburns, a man named Smythe, as the train clanged to a halt and released twin hissing billows of steam. Byron, Cole, Cromane, and Harold all leapt from an iron running board to a wooden platform. Harold wagged his tail and nuzzled Byron's hand. A glance passed between Rochester, who was the first to disembark, and the sergeant, who gave a curt nod. "New Oak's boys will come with me. Unfortunately, your animal cannot go where we're going. Shall I have one of my men take it to the kennels?" "We can't leave Harold," Cole said, surprising himself, because he'd always been the more aloof of the brothers. "He saved our lives," he said. "Nevertheless, we shall be dining with Lord Douglas." He brushed some soot from his shoulder. "And your pet is most certainly not invited." "What about Cromane?" Byron asked. "Can he watch Harold? They like each other well enough." "I regret that it will not be possible to place them together." "Why not?" Byron's eyes widened. "What are you going to do to Cromane?" "Cromane," Rochester said, the name with some distaste, "isn't your concern." He turned to Smythe. "Take the prisoner to the guardhouse. Place him there in a private cell. See to it." "Yes, sir," Smythe replied. "Very good, sir." He clicked his heels. "Johnson," Rochester ordered, "take the dog to the kennels. See to it that it's fed." "Sir?" Johnson nodded. "Come along now." Rochester beckoned to the brothers, his tone commanding. "I shall tolerate neither arguments nor delays."